All right, we're going to look at the new imperialism of Europeans that occurs at the end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century, and really marks this kind of era of modernization in global politics and has a huge impact on the world as we know it today. So, first, we see there is a new method of expansion. Well, a new old method, if you will. From 1815, like the era leading up to this time, 1815 to 1880, most overseas European control and influence that they exerted was economic. That is, they relied heavily on setting up trading outposts and being wealthier than the people in the area they were at and dominating that way. Under this system, nations basically maintained autonomy, but because they lacked money, they really were not the ones who were truly in power. So the Europeans came in with their money and granted political autonomy, but maintained almost total control over the natives who were there. We see this start to change in 1880 as Europeans move from just controlling colonies economically to controlling them politically as well. And this is really reflecting the early colonial efforts that we had seen in the 14, 15, and 1600s. Like, this is, although it is a new imperialism in many, many ways, it's an old imperialism as well. Just a kind of regurgitation and retread of previous efforts. Only this time, instead of looking at North, South, and Central America, the Europeans look at Africa and Asia. And there are some pretty serious consequences to this. World War I is one of those. But also really lasting political legacies. So a lot of the problems that we see that exist in the world, conflict between India and Pakistan, conflict in the Middle East, conflict in Africa, a lot of that, all of that, truly, is the result of this European imperialism and Europeans' kind of sense of superiority that leaves the rest of the world behind. So we'll start with the Scramble for Africa, and it's worth noting that in 1880, less than 10% of Africa was controlled by Europeans. It was basically Algeria, which had been conquered by France, South Africa, which had been conquered by the Dutch, and then scattered trading posts throughout the rest of Africa, mostly along the coast. And a lot of these were legacies of, like, original Portuguese and Spanish efforts to sail around the coast of Africa, and so they had maintained their trading post and had indeed set up some colonies along there. But despite this kind of lack of European influence in Africa in 1880, by 1900 the entire continent except Ethiopia and Liberia was completely controlled by them. So you have, in less than 20 years, the whole continent is subjugated by Europeans. And the reason why Ethiopia is able to stay out of it is they have a leader, Menelik II, who is aware of what's happening, purchases weapons from Russia, plays Europeans against each other, like makes various alliances with the British and the French, and drives off the Italians eventually with a strong modernized army using weapons he had purchased. And Liberia is spared because that was set up and kind of sponsored in many ways by the Americans, who had sent former slaves there to colonize it under James Monroe, hence the name of their capital, Monrovia. So all those countries except Ethiopia and Liberia were controlled by Europeans. So we see this drastic shift, and this kind of really starts going as a result of English control of Egypt in 1882. They had previously economically controlled it in order to control the Suez, and when there was some kind of pushback, they moved in and controlled it politically as well. And so this new model of colonization really kind of opened up this rush for colonies that we see in the late 1800s. Trying to jump on this quickly, you have the King of Belgium, Leopold II, who seeks to expand Belgian influence in the Congo area, an area super rich in natural resources that had drawn the attention of many people because various authors had gone in there to report on what they had seen. And so Leopold sought to control that for numbers of reasons. he was intrigued by it, but also rubber plants grew there, which could be used in the factories of Belgium. And so this really kicks off this action of Leopold II taking control, frightens the French, frightens the Germans, and frightens the British. And so it really kicks off this scramble for Africa, as we call it, the vast riches of Africa. And in order to kind of prevent this from getting too chaotic, an international conference is scheduled for 1884 to 1885 in Berlin. And Otto von Bismarck is the one who schedules this, and he sets it up. And the goal is to divide Africa up in order to prevent massive conflict in Europe. Now, it should be noted that present at this meeting were a bunch of Europeans and not a single African. And so, in this goal to break this up, in order to make it seem moderately fair for Europeans involved, they said that for Europeans to claim any of the land in Africa, they had to show the ability to, quote, effective occupation. So they needed to be able to effectively occupy this region, which meant they needed to be able to provide troops, build an infrastructure, and maintain political order. This leaves out some of the smaller European powers. It opens the door for some of the larger ones, but nonetheless, some of those smaller powers like Belgium and Portugal and Spain had already sunk their teeth into part of Africa, and they were able to maintain control there. So this effective occupation is the key term. You have to prove that you can not only control this, but improve upon it. And so then begins the scramble, and Europeans divide up Africa so no one country gained too much land. One of the only kind of good thing to come out of this Berlin Conference is there's an agreement to stop slavery and the slave trade within Africa. And so there is, you see that for all of its awfulness at the Berlin Conference, some of the reform-minded ideas of Europe at this time shine through in Berlin. In Asia, you see that there's sort of a different type of imperialism happening. So before 1815, the only major presence in Asia were the Dutch in Indonesia. The British have India at that point as well, which I guess is a big deal. But then we start to see kind of changing roles, where in the 1880s, France takes over a region known as Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. India, Japan, and China face pressure from the Europeans. And then we see two other kind of newbies to the game who don't get involved in the scramble for Africa, but Western nations that also seek to imperialize, and they focus on Asia. And that is the Americans, who conquer the Philippines and imperialize that. And then the Russians, who start to look for lands in Central Asia, and then even kind of slicing off some bits of border with the Chinese, specifically in Manchuria and Mongolia. So imperialism in Asia looks a little bit different. It's not nearly as organized, and it's also not as effective. Most of the focus is in on Africa. There's a number of reasons for this new imperialism. One of the big ones is industrialization. It's economic motive. So as the industrial machine gets going, there is a need for raw resources and raw materials that were not provided in Europe, and they needed to be provided from somewhere. And that somewhere was Asia and Africa. And you could continue trading for it, but if you were the one who controlled the areas of production, then you were able to get those goods for a lot cheaper. And so this is important, and this causes then people to really, really want to take over all of these territories. That way they controlled, again, one of the factors of production is controlling the supplies. Another reason why you see this new imperialism is that it's viewed often as a political necessity. So a lot of people, rulers and others, argue that in order to be a great power, and in order to be considered legitimate and respected in Europe, you needed to have colonies and overseas territories. And if you did not possess those, then you weren't truly a great power. And so this pressure causes this colonization. Right? We can't fall behind France. We can't fall behind Britain. We need to keep up with them in order to prove our goodness. There are also significant racial attitudes going on here. Social Darwinists and other European attitudes push for colonization. Rudyard Kipling writes a famous poem called The White Man's Burden that argues that there's this massive need for Europeans to civilize non-Europeans and bring them new ideas. And this kind of attitude still carries on in many ways to this day, and it's a very dangerous one. It's an idea that your way is the best way and that everyone else must be backwards if they don't follow your way. And so these racial attitudes then, it's okay for us to take this land. These natives who are inept are not using it properly, are not finding the resources. They're not taking advantage of their situation. Thus, we should be allowed to take advantage of their situation. And also, we need to bring civilizing effects to them and show them how to properly run a country. On top of all of this, there are also then special interests at play. Politicians like the idea of colonizing because it distracts from problems at home. People who are involved in the economics, whether they are shipping, whether they are productions, have necessarily have like rooted interests in doing this, and so they could exploit these opportunities, so they push for their country to expand as well. So there's a ton of different causes for this imperialism. It's really hard to pin down one of them as being the main cause, but all of this plays into why Europeans suddenly in the late 1800s decide we need to look elsewhere. It's a desire for more money, it's a desire to prove superiority, and it's a desire to kind of continue this never-ending conflict between different governments, and a way for politicians to manipulate the people in order to stay in power. So all of this kind of plays into it. We'll then look at kind of how Europeans or non-Europeans respond to imperialism. And first is India. And India is initially ruled indirectly by Britain. So Britain allows for the Indians to continue ruling themselves and just kind of seeks to have economic dominance there. However, there is a series of events known as the Great Rebellion from 1857 to 1858. And this is kind of northern India, or the northern Indian subcontinent, rises up against the British. The British use other southern Indian troops to kind of squash this rebellion, put an end to it, and at that point they take direct control over the subcontinent of India. They say that we can't trust you to run this yourselves and keep things in control, therefore we will take control. And so the result is you have this really, really, really small group of civil servants who are all white British men who are running the country of India. And so you have a few thousand men suppressing a few hundred million. And so this creates tension and conflict and problems. And at a certain point, the British realized that they needed help ruling locally. They needed to get other people on board. They needed to get the natives on board. And so they began offering secondary education in India. Of course, this education is only offered in English and in a Western style. So the people that they are bringing through this program tend to be sympathetic to the British perspective because that is how they are being taught. And so we see that the people who are the first to take advantage of this are the high-caste Hindus. And just as a quick refresher and brush up on Indian culture, they at this point were running through a caste system, which was a social hierarchy in which you were born into and could not advance higher or lower than you could go lower than your kid, but you could not advance up a caste. You were stuck where you were born. It was a very, very rigid system. Think of the feudal hierarchies of Europe, but even more strict. And so the high caste Hindus take advantage of this. Now, this is important because it's going to eventually, if you follow Indian history not very far down the line, create conflict between Hindus and Muslims and other ethnicities and religions within the Indian subcontinent. But despite these advances that are made and these opportunities, these Indians, even the ones who are helping the British, are always, always, always viewed as second-class citizens. They are not privy to the same clubs and restaurants and opportunities that the British who are living in India are. So there is still a lot of us and them going on. To compound the problem there, within the Indian subcontinent, there's tension between different cultures and religions. So again, the Muslims and the Hindus don't get along, and that plays out today as a problem between Pakistan and India, but also different cultures. India was, at the point when the British came through, was not truly unified. And so the British take over this kind of confederation of small independent countries and try to make it one and say, you are all this, and we are going to rule you the same. And of course, they all have unique needs and different cultures, and so that is a problem. So despite all of these tensions, in 1885, we begin to see the beginnings of an Indian independence movement when well-educated Indians form something called the Indian National Congress, where they demand self-government and equality within the British Commonwealth. And this is, again, it's dominated by this high-caste Hindus who have been educated in the British system, but it does get support kind of from a broad swath of the population. So that is kind of the India example of a response to imperialism. That is the case study for India. And again, they were ruled directly, but begin to take advantage of their rulers' opportunities, and through that education push for independence. A different case study, and certainly a very unique one, is Japan. In the mid-1800s, Japan was forced open by a number of Western countries, but in large part by the United States and Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet. And so they recognize, there is a recognition in Japan in the 1800s that if they don't change something, they are very susceptible to Western dominance. And so we get what we see as the Meiji Restoration, where it is an overthrow, a complete overthrow of the old Japanese samurai and feudal system, and a real push for modernization. The Japanese reformers recognize that they need to modernize Japan and strengthen the military in order to fend off this foreign threats. They had seen what's happening in China, which we'll get to in a minute, but they had seen what was happening throughout the world, really, and they were seeking to prevent that from happening there. And so what we see is Japan builds factories, railroads, they change their social structure and build a modern army. And so they're really modeling themselves off the Western way, so much so that they even adopt Western imperialism, and they attack weaker nations and conquer them. Specifically, they conquer the Korean peninsula and then the island of Formosa, which now we call Taiwan. And they take those from China. And so we see that Japan really, really adopts the Western style. So in response to Western imperialism, Japan adopts the Western style and pushes back as an independent nation. And the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 proved that Japan had industrialized and that they were, in fact, an important international country. That is them kind of finally coming to the stage and proving that non-European nations could be as strong as European nations. And then the China case study we'll look at. China is threatened by Western imperialism. China for a long time had been a trade partner of the West under the Qing dynasty, but had also been kind of a source of desire for the West. And so Westerners have been trying to open it for a long time. China had run kind of a closed-door policy where they were only trading with certain countries from certain ports. But Westerners were really trying to open it up. They were, for a while, able to prevent total defeat by having kind of skilled politician and the simple fact that Westerners looked elsewhere for colonization, specifically to Africa. But what slowly, as the 1800s progress, things get worse and worse. They lose the Sino-Japanese War in the late 1800s. That threatens to destroy China. And so finally, at the end, we see that within China, there are two groups. There's a group that wants to reform and act in many ways like the Japanese did. They want to, some want to overthrow the government, like Sun Yat-sen, and we'll get to him later in World War II. And others want to just reform the government. And so we see them launching 100 Days of Reform. This is met with a lot of resistance through more conservative groups who want to go back to the way China used to be. And they want to expel foreigners. And this kind of comes to a head through something called the Boxer Rebellion, which is a secret society that pushes to drive out Westerners. They kill a few hundred of them, mostly Christian missionaries. And the result of this then is it draws the ire and attention of the West to China. And the Europeans respond by attacking, occupying Chinese cities, and forcing heavy reparations and peace settlements on the Chinese as retribution for these attacks. All of this then culminates in the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, after surviving hundreds of years. And so, with these three nations of India, Japan, and China, you see kind of unique case studies and responses to imperialism. India is, they don't embrace imperialism, but they have been conquered, and they build out from within the confines and within that kind of structure of being conquered to strengthen themselves and push for independence. Japan, upon first encounter, recognized that if they don't transform radically, they will too be conquered, and so they transform radically. China sits somewhere in between, where there's internal conflict about whether or not they should reform, whether or not they should stay the same, and what they should really be doing in response to this imperial threat. Because of this inaction, individuals in China take it upon themselves to act in certain ways, and the result of this is backfiring. It draws the frustration and ire of Westerners, and it weakens China internally because they do not stand united, and eventually China falls significantly to this imperialism.